Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Rugby Reclined. Nice to have you with us. And one of the joys about Rugby Reclined is that we can go anywhere with anyone. It's not often we bring props to our party, but we're going into this today, which I'm going to be honest, David, and I'm going to introduce David in just a moment, is a pretty weighty tome. And if any of you need a doorstop at home, this is certainly going to do the job. But it's the most wonderful book called Brothers in Arms. And the fabulous thing about it is, for anyone who's nostalgic, romantic, and loves anything to do with French rugby, this is for you. But it also has the sort of double addition of making you incredibly thirsty for fine wines and incredibly hungry for good food. It's pretty much the ultimate rugby book. David Beresford is the author. It's very nice to have you on Rugby Reclined. So many things to talk to you about. Shall we start, first of all, with... I mean, it is the ultimate rugby book. Have people given you that before?
Well, in terms of describing it as the ultimate rugby book, yeah, I think they have. I mean, I think, people that I have received just so many messages, social media, emails from people who love it. And I guess when I set out that I wanted to write something that actually I wanted to read, it was a really self-indulgent project.
Yeah.
And I spoke to a few editors and agents, and a few of them said, "You don't want to do that. You want to do this." And I was like, "No. I want to do my project.
Yeah.
I want to read something that I would like to read." And that's how it started. So, fortunately, that same thought process, I think, has appealed to lots of people that I've received all the emails and all the messages from, and they've really got into it. And you get people that love the food and wine side. When you say to people, "What was your favorite article?" I think everybody has a different favorite article. I've got my own favorites, I guess, but everybody has different favorites. Some people love the kind of nostalgic bit. Some people rave about, well, you were one, right? You loved, I think it was Jean-Baptiste Lafont.
Yeah,
was one of your favorite players.
Absolutely. Jean-Baptiste and Laurent Caban was my other absolute sort of idol growing up, because they slightly stand apart from Blanco and Sella, who are so well known. I love that sort of slight underlayer as well. But tell me a little bit, first of all, just about you and about how a proud Englishman came to write such an amazingly romantic tome to French rugby.
Well, I did French at university, so I'm born and bred in Bath, and went on an exchange to teach English as a foreign language after I left King Edward School in Bath, and then went to Loughborough. I took a year off and ended up in Avignon, right down in the south. Yeah. And I was then going to, I went to Loughborough University to study French. Went back to play rugby during my third year at Loughborough, back to Bordeaux. Came back to Loughborough, finished my degree, and then went back and lived in France again with a big management consulting firm. So I lived there for a long, long time, really between 86 and 93. I was probably there at least 4 years across that period. And therefore, and of course, that was the time when the French rugby was absolutely at its peak. The Bonnivals, the Charvet, Toulouse were magnificent, winning everything. Charvet, the most beautiful rugby player of all time, was everybody's hero. Obviously, Lafont was playing at the time. Blanco was in his prime. Sella was in his prime. It was just a brilliant era for French rugby. And England, conversely, at the time, were rubbish, actually. If you think we won the Grand Slam in 1980, somehow, and then England were very poor, really, until Will Carling took on the captaincy from 89. And then from 89 onwards, we were very good, right? And the French kind of lost most games against us. So I was brought up in France, really, in that golden era. And I loved the players. And the reality is I wanted to be one, right? I wanted to be a Bonnival and a Blanco and a Charvet. And I ended up playing, firstly, when I was there, I was 18 at the time, living in Avignon. And the school I taught at, there was a teacher. The library was next door to my teaching room, and her son played rugby for Chateauneuf-du-Pape, of all places. And she said to me, come and play rugby at Chateauneuf-du-Pape. So I did, and that's how it started. So I was totally immersed in this fantastic culture that wasn't just about rugby at all. Rugby and life was so ingrained in people's lives, and that food, wine, rugby culture just intersected. And that's how I fell in love with it all.
Please tell me the Chateauneuf-du-Pape post-match was as Chateauneuf-du-Pape should be.
Well, I actually tell a story. I think it's in the introduction for Provence and Mediterranean, where at 18 you don't really have an appreciation for fine wine, but after training we would come up. If you've ever been, I don't know if you've ever been to Chateauneuf-du-Pape, but it's a quintessential French village. Clearly very wine dominated, and right in the middle there there was and there still is a big bar, and we used to go in there after training and after matches actually as well. And the locals would bring us great big plates of paella, but we would drink 1664 Kronenberg in those days because we didn't have an appreciation for it. But every time I go back to that bar, which is now a great restaurant, and of course enjoy the fine wine. But at the time, hey, 18-year-olds, our palates weren't sophisticated enough back in those days.
Well, I was going to say, you learn fast, I hope. It's better than drinking special brew out of your left boot or whatever it is that grassroots clubs in England do.
Yeah, quite.
It's a wonderful book, and it's a wonderful story, and it's a wonderful journey that you've been on. How did the sort of concept come out? Obviously, you were in love with all things French rugby, and you wanted to write a tome. But how do you start? Could you give us a synopsis of the book? I mean, I've sort of spoken about what it covers, but how did the story come about?
Well, in terms of answer your question, the synopsis of the book, the way I would describe it is sort of it's part chronicle, part dialogue, part travelogue, really. Which it sounds like a real mishmash, but I would say my big advice, and actually I would say this in business as well, is don't overthink it. Don't overplan, don't overthink it, don't over-strategize. Come up with an outline idea and just go do it and see where it takes you. And that was my philosophy. But what happened was I always had this sort of idea. Well, I say always had this idea. Over the last few years, I had this idea before I wrote the book that I wanted to go and meet all the players, again, very self-indulgently. So I was involved in floating a business on the stock market in 2015, and I left that business in the middle of 2017 and thought, right, I'm just going to go down to France and chill out. And I ended up going down into the Biarritz area. And then I came back and I thought, right, I'm going to do this, right? I'm absolutely going to do this. Actually, I was in the Pyrenees then. I was more in the Pyrenees, right in just sort of Tarbes, Lourdes, Central Pyrenees, really, where sort of Jean-Pierre Garouet and Dantron and those guys played. So I came back with this idea and I concocted it. I thought, well, I need to test it a little bit. So I concocted this sort of email in French, and I tracked down Jean-Pierre Rive, because he's an artist and has got a website. Laurent Rodriguez, because he's a hotelier and had a website. Same with Serge. Same with Pascal Ondarts. Didier Codognu, one of the most beautiful centres, diminutive figure, played sort of late 70s, early 80s, fell out with Jacques Faroux because he was too small, which is ironic because Jack was also very small, but Jack liked big beasts. But so I contacted Didier Codognu as well, because he's a politician, big politician actually in the south of France. And Eric Champ was the other one. And I pinged off this email, and it was one Sunday evening, pinged it off, 9 o'clock, Monday morning, I get a French number on my phone. I'm kind of eating my Marmite on toast. I get this number on my phone, from France. And I just said, hello. He said, bonjour David, c'est Jean-Pierre. And it was Jean-Pierre Rive. Pretty cool, right?
Pretty good way to start the book. Yeah, well, I mean, that's...
Pretty good way to start the book.
That's so a good opening gambit.
And he said to me, because he speaks quite good English, actually, he said to me in an American accent, of course I'm in. We're all a big rugby fraternity, aren't we? That's what he said. And that started it. So on the back of that, I mean, it took me about, at least a dozen trips, at least, and a very tolerant wife to let me go back and write it.
Yeah. But I based quite a robust liver as well, I would imagine.
Very robust liver. I mean, I had to get into, I like to think I got into calorie deficit because I knew I was going to get into calorie surplus. But ended up in Biarritz and actually a combination of really Serge after a 3-hour lunch, which he may have had chance, or may not have had chance to read the book yet, but a 3-hour lunch with Serge and Pascal Ondarts, they were the glue that gave me all the contacts.
You've set it beautifully because, the 70s was obviously the decade of Wales and the 90s was the decade of Carling's England and 80s was France. Yeah. I just wonder, sort of, when you look at the book as a whole, why was that the era of French rugby? And not only sort of, it was so representative of France in the way that they played and the characters that came through. We obviously saw France lose their way in the last 10, 15 years or so. Hopefully they're on their way back. But why was the 80s French rugby?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I guess several reasons. I think there was clearly a great cohort of players, wonderful players at the time. I mean, it's once in a generation, isn't it, that you get a Serge Blanco that turns up. But they actually had a Blanco, a Charvet, a Sella, a Lagisque. They had all these tremendous backs, I think, with great flair. So, and the game back then, of course, it's completely different now. There was space on the pitch. And that lent itself to good players who could see space. You didn't have these sort of defenses that just fanned out. So I think it was definitely, a product of the players, definitely. I think there were players like Dubroca and Berbizier who were essential to the side. Berbizier was never my favourite scrum half. I was much more of a sort of Jerome Gallion, if you can remember him.
I do remember him. Yeah.
Fabulous player from Toulon, little dentist, who was actually reminds me of Antoine Dupont, or Antoine Dupont reminds me of Jerome Gallion, spitting images.
He had a very upright
stocky,
running style, didn't he, Gallion? Not big, but just...
Well, yeah, but
like
low centre of gravity, but
just
fabulous player, very, very intelligent guy. But Berbizier was what all the other French players would call le stratège, right? Translates itself. He was the strategic thinker. He was actually very much the captain on the pitch, really. So I think Berbizier was essential to the success of that side. He knew how to motivate players. He was very clever. He would watch games, but watch the opposition before and come up with a game plan. He was able to adjust that game plan. Even though I don't think he was the greatest player, he was a fantastic stratège captain, or sort of vice captain, I would say. And then I think you got Jacques Ferrou, who was essential. And Jack, I think, understood almost professional rugby before it became professional. So he knew you needed really big, hard men up front who would win the ball and secure possession. And that's why he went for really big, hard, mentally tough players. And when he first came on the scene, Jack, as a coach, I think it was 1980 actually he took over, because he won. I think it was 1981 he took over at first, and he won a Grand Slam that year. But you could see him tinkering with the team in sort of 82, 83, because they still weren't the best then. He was tinkering with the team, working out what his best team was, not necessarily his best players, but what his best team was. And he was the guy that picked the likes of Laurent Rodriguez, Pascal Ondarts, and these were really, really hard men. So I think, Jack was essential, I think, to the whole success of that team. And he was a sensational motivator. I never had the pleasure of meeting him, but the players revere him even now. He was the absolute top dog, both as a captain. When he captained that great French side in '77 that won the Grand Slam with the same 15 players and didn't concede a try, the old Five Nations. And he knew how to create success, so that he's still revered today by the players. Bless him, even though he's obviously passed away. And I went to meet his son as well. And Jean-Baptiste also said to me that, he said, Dad, he was obviously a very proud son. He said, Dad, he was a pioneer of professional rugby before it even existed. He understood how to win. He understood the importance of sort of nutrition and fitness regimes. So Jack was an essential part of that mix, I think. And that team really peaked in '86. The first year I ended up in France, I lived in France, in Châteauneuf-du-Pape. And I remember watching in '86, England against France at Twickenham, and the French absolutely destroyed us. That was the real pinnacle, I think, of Jack's team. And of course, they beat the All Blacks at the famous Battle of Nantes as well.
Yes.
In 1986.
Was that the infamous game where Buck Shelford lost more than he was anticipating?
He had a torn scrotum, and Fitzy tells the story as well. He's told me many times.
Yeah.
But and actually, there's quite a good YouTube video that Buck talks about the whole match, and I spoke to Buck about it as well. And really, what happened was the French had lost the first test. Well, actually, come back. Let's just rewind a second. This was the team. This was very much the. I think the sort of transitioning from an old All Blacks team to a new All Blacks team. And of course, they'd some of the players as well. I can't remember the exact timing of it, but you had the whole New Zealand Cavaliers tour to South Africa as well at the time, so they were missing some players.
Yeah.
So there were lots of very, very young new caps in that team, and the All Blacks had beaten France in Toulouse the previous week, and they changed a few players out, and they'd gone to Nantes, and the French players knew, and Jack knew, that if they didn't have a successful match, the chances are they weren't going to be picked for the World Cup team the following year, which obviously took place in '87 for the first time. So there was sort of this massive motivation, and Jack worked them all up into an absolute frenzy, which was his want before the game. And Fitzy said he said they came out and absolutely smashed us from the first ruck. He said we didn't know what had hit us. He said they came out with kind of pupils out here, stinking of garlic, is what Fitzy says. And he said, and of course, Buck's convinced, even now, he's convinced they were on some sort of, drug, and they were accused of this in the press, and obviously cleared of it, and all the players absolutely deny that.
Right.
But they got absolutely
What
smashed.
what do you believe?
I don't believe they were on drugs at the time. I mean, Pascal on darts. I mean, Pascal's the most honest guy you'd ever meet. And Pascal said, we were just a young bunch of amateur players trying to get to the World Cup the following year. He said, we used to take a bit of aspirin and a bit of, the kind of vitamin sort of supplements. But he said it was all completely legal. So he vehemently denies it. But actually, I think it was Jean-Pierre Garouet, the great Jean-Pierre, top bloke, and one of the other players, who was it? It was another prop, I think, they took a French journalist to court and won damages.
Oh, really?
In fact, it was Pascal, actually. It was Pascal on darts and Jean-Pierre Garouet took a French journalist to court for making those accusations and putting a picture up on the front of L'Equipe. It was, I'm going back to 1987. So yeah, they took it very, very personally and absolutely deny it.
Wow.
But in that game, that's why Buck said he got smashed 3 times. He said
he lost his teeth, didn't he?
Yeah, he said he was in a ruck. He was like Jackley in a ruck on his line, and he said he looked up and he saw Jean-Pierre Garouet, all 120 kilograms of him, flying horizontal through the air, smashed him in the face, lost his teeth. He said it was knocked out, and he said the thing that really finished him off as well was being kicked in the nuts and tearing his scrotum.
Yeah.
And he said it was, they obviously all win. So Buck's very sort of, Buck still takes it quite personally, I think.
Yes, I'm not surprised.
It was a long time ago.
Yeah. The wonderful thing about your book is just, and I suppose if you compare it to, the Welsh side of the 70s, we're a very tight bunch, and not necessarily from similar backgrounds, but probably quite a sort of, you could throw a blanket over most of them as characters. England, again in 90s, not all the same, but relatively sort of the same ilk. The thing about your book is that the characters are extraordinary in the variety. Everyone from Franck Menel and his pink bow ties at half time for Racing, through to Marc Session, who's been to jail for sadly in an incident involved in shooting his wife. I mean. Do you look back and look at this book now and just sort of wonder how the hell such a broad range of characters were able to achieve so much?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, there were lots of very similar characters in there as well. And a lot of the guys had grown up from childhood and lived near each other because most of the rugby was played in the Southwest. But then you've also got some extremities, you're right. And the guys from Racing Club up in Paris were different, right? That was a much more traditional sort of British way of playing. That was all about discipline up in Racing Club. It was a club that was formed out of the prestigious Lycée in Paris many years ago, whereas the rugby in the Southwest was all about independence and free spirit. So you did have some differences, but I think but when Blanco would say, he said we really loved each other, and we still do, right? Now a few of them have fallen out actually, but there was a real kind of fondness and love between the players, and which I think was probably driven in part by the fact that they've just got this sort of Latin, more emotional mindset, I think. But they were very, very close. I mean, now what you find is that, Berbizier has sort of fallen out. Berbizier is really a man of the mountains, actually, even though he played for Agen, and he was never very close to the Agen guys. So there's a bit of tension between them, and there's a bit of tension. So Dubrocca and Berbizier, there was always tension because Dubrocca took over a coach in 1991 and didn't select Berbizier as his joint coach. So there was rivalry there. Dubrocca's very close with Serge, so Serge and Berbizier don't talk. Actually, so when I had this lunch, I said to Serge, I'm trying to get hold of Pierre Berbizier, and he said, I don't know his number. So you've got a little bit of animosity there. But then you talk about Marc Session, who, I mean, what an absolute, tragedy, shooting his wife and murdering his wife. And Mark did, many years in jail. But when I met Mark, if you didn't know the backstory, you would just think he was just another lovely bloke, right? He was gentle, quiet, softly spoken, passionate, emotional, but he suffered terribly from, he always suffered from alcoholism. And he suffered terribly when he stopped playing because, of course, his whole sort of self-worth diminished, and that just, compounded the problems of alcoholism that he had. But the players today still look after Mark. They still watch out for him. As Pascal said to me, what's the point in kicking a guy when he's down and kicking him when he's down in the gutter? We have to try and support these guys. He's still a human being. He's still got daughters.
Yeah.
So Pascal has always been incredibly supportive. He said, we can't forgive Mark, but we've got to try and support him. You know, he's still a human being. And when Mark was in prison, actually, the players got together a team and played against Mark's team in the prison. They actually played against each other.
Oh, really?
When he was in the prison in Muret, just south of Toulouse, yeah.
Wow. I will forever, and I remember him forever being a sort of rampaging ape, but I will forever remember the '91 World Cup quarterfinal and
absolutely
Mick the Munch and that incredible hit. I want to finish by asking you the three who you'd pick for the ultimate dinner, I suppose, if you could. By the sound of it, you've had enough booze and food for a long time. But the other thing I wanted to pick up on is there aren't many rugby books out there that include Russian roulette either, and I just sort of, I mean, the story around that, but I'd love to know sort of also subsequent to that, the journey that you went on and the points at which you just found yourself thinking, I can't quite believe that we're discussing this, having set out to talk about French rugby.
Yeah. Well, you're talking about Armand Vaquerin. I mean, the most celebrated, most British people would never have heard of Armand. And Armand played predominantly in the 70s, but I squeezed him into my team on the basis that he played in the early 80s as well for France. And that was one of the criteria I had to apply. Otherwise, I could have just gone on forever.
Yeah.
But Armand played for the great Béziers side back in the 70s and early 80s. And he actually won the French championship 10 times. Can you imagine that? Wow. I think he appeared in, was it 11 finals and they won 10 out of the 11? I mean, it was extraordinary. And he was a real character off the pitch, lovely guy, big character, again, suffered terribly when he stopped playing and killed himself, allegedly, playing Russian roulette in a dusty, small, crappy bar in the middle of Béziers in 1993, about lunchtime. And, you know, the story goes that he always had a gun in his car for some reason. And he would play this game where he would knock out the bullets. So obviously the revolver was, the gun wasn't loaded. And then he would pretend to play it. And apparently this time, you know, his trick didn't work. A bullet stayed in there and it got him. That was apparently the story. But I'd heard about Armand through a very good friend of mine who's very tied up in Béziers Rugby Club. And I wanted to go down and meet his brother, because I think, you know, one of the things I didn't want to do with the 4 players who have died, you know, who I write about, I didn't just want to do secondary research. I wanted to go and meet somebody from the family. Yeah. So this guy called Diego Minaro, who runs the academy for Béziers, great guy, set me up to meet up with Elie, Armand's brother. And, you know, Elie, even today, and I talk about it in the book, you know, you can see the sadness in his eyes. He's never got over the death of his brother. They were incredibly close. And he described the story to me.
The final thing I just want to ask is, it was such a golden era. What do you, and how do you assess kind of the end of it, really? Was it the 91 World Cup quarterfinal exit? Was it not? You talk about Ondarts. I remember him being sent off in 92, again at the Parc des Princes against England. It sort of seemed to blow up quite spectacularly.
Yeah.
Well, actually, would that be right or not? Or did they cling on for a bit?
Well, Pascal had retired before 91. So the teams that got sent, the props that got sent off was, well, Moscato was one, and I think it was Jambert.
Yeah, that was Jambert, was it?
Jambert, yeah. So that was the year after Pascal. So Pascal had retired before 91, but 91 was definitely the changing of the guard. So Eric Champ, you know, played in that match. Session, but lots of the players, you know, Denis Charbet wasn't on that in that team. Eric Bonival, brilliant player, had been injured. Serge was his final game, actually, that 91 quarter final. So it was very much a changing of the guard. But of course, and it was the changing of the guard a bit for, well, it was definitely, and obviously England were getting stronger at the time. Yeah. And I think it was, and France probably took until 95, you know, that sort of era when Saint-André, Galtier, Ibanez, you know, were really getting very strong in the late 90s, sorry. I think is when France came back and had a good period under Pierre Villepre, in fact. So that was very much a changing the guard. And, you know, of course, Roumat was around in that era as well. You mentioned Laurent Caban. Laurent didn't feature in my book because he didn't play for France in the 80s. He only started at about 91, but of course, he was a brilliant player. Benetton. So they came good again, but it took a few years for them to transition into a good team.
Yeah. It's a wonderful book. We'll stick links all over it. It's wonderful. I mean, I love the fact that you set out to write the book that you wanted to read. This is almost the sort of the halcyon sort of show for me, because I just grew up. I mean, I started, I think I said in 1990, started watching it, but retrospectively, I've seen so much footage of, Blanco, the 87 World Cup. And I suppose sort of finally, I mean, it's a very different game that we have now. It's a very different world that we have now, but France 2023, knowing the country as you do, and watching the team come together as it is, high hopes for another belting Rugby World Cup?
I hope so. I mean, I'd love France to win it. I mean, people say to me, England against France, who do you support? But I kind of think of myself now I kind of hedge my bets a bit, right? And I'm thinking, well, maybe 60-40 in favour of England. Depends whether I like, the coach at the time. But I really hope they come good. And I think certainly under Rafa, who I met and had a great conversation with, Rafa Ibanez, I'm sure you've met him many times, Alex, down in Dax in a little cafe in his hometown as I was writing the book.
Yeah.
And what struck me about Rafa was, his as a communicator and a thinker, and on a personal level, he is so impressive. But he's got a tough, hard edge to him as well. There's a slightly mad kind of Latin element to him as well. And I think that combination with Galtier on the pitch as the sort of technical coach is a brilliant combination. Of course, with Sean Edwards there as well, the defence stepped up. So I do think they have got a very, very good chance of getting through, of winning it. You've got to say that on home territory. By 2023, they'll have even more caps. They've got some game breakers, haven't they? With the likes of Antoine Dupont. I think Olivon's a fabulous player.
Yep.
Aldrit, half Scottish, he's a fabulous player.
Yeah.
Fingers crossed there. And I thought Jalibert was magnificent actually recently. Better than Intermac, who got injured, of course. But fingers crossed.
They've got a lot of talent and hopefully enough characters for Brothers in Arms 2, which you can start on in 2024 and test the liver out again. That's the dream.
Well, yeah, I'd have to get some permission from my wife before I write another book. But to be honest, I could certainly cover that late 90s era, under Rafa would be a great era to cover off as well. Because
some belting players, weren't they?
Dominici, of course, bless him as well. Dominici was in that side. There were some fantastic players. Josion, maybe a bit later, Josion.
French rugby does produce rock stars, doesn't it? I don't know whether that's a French thing or just a French rugby, or I don't know, but they have got some brilliant characters. We'd love the details of the Chateau Neuf de Pape Rugby Club, because I think Good, Bad and Rugby would like to do a little live show there. Perhaps deep in the wine cellar. Who knows? That can be our takeaway.
Well, we could sort that out. In fact, they've merged now, I think, with Orange. But it's just a great year. I don't know if you've been there, Alex, but for food and wine and general culture, it is, I can see why maybe productivity isn't very strong in the south of France in the middle of summer.
Yeah.
Lunching's much more fun than working.
There's a proverb in there somewhere, I think. David, lovely to chat. Thank you very much indeed, A, for the book, and B, for your time. And as I say, we'll plaster this all over links. And I highly, highly recommend it. If you're a rugby romantic, this is definitely a book for you. Lovely to chat. Keep well.
Likewise. Thanks, Alex. Cheers.
All the best.
Take care. See you soon. Bye.